Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank Friday for Birds organizers for inviting me to come to give this talk. It's a pleasure to be here. This platform is proving to be a good venue for networking, for sharing knowledge, for mobilizing support for bird research and bird conservation. So may this keep going. Before I forget, I would like to present a lot of thank yous. I'll also throw to the talk because there's so many people to thank, many organizations. And those I'm thanking will be, I'll be showing their logos. So that's a way, as you can see, for instance, on my screen, we've got the RSPB logo, that's where I work. Then Ecological Restoration Fund, the AG Foundation, Life, Darwin, those are the main sponsors of my program. And then RSPB is part of the BirdLife family of NGOs. So again, their logo will be shown throughout the presentation. I would like also to thank many researchers and scientists, because the work I'll be talking, it's mostly conservation, but conservation without sound science, I will be going nowhere. There are lots of data, a lot of published work that goes into the application we do on the ground, working with communities. And I want to be acknowledging those scientists, but if you hear your work being cited and used in this presentation, please accept my thanks. A final thanks I would like to send to my colleague, Nick Williams. Nick is the Communications Outreach Officer in International Department here at RSPB. Most of the beautiful photos I'll be using in the talk, he took them over the last 18 months. And those photos which he didn't take and I used in the talk, I make sure that are duly acknowledged. The copyright of those photos that Nick took belong to the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, or the RSPB. The subject I'm addressing today then is conserving migratory birds at flyway scale. Throughout the talk, the word flyway will be used to mean the East Atlantic flyway. I know there are many colleagues and friends who join us from other flyways, but in this particular case, when I talk about flyway, I'll be meaning the East Atlantic flyway that I'm going to show in a moment. And there are two groups of birds I'm going to be addressing, the waterbirds and landbirds. And the purpose it chose not to use migratory landbirds, migratory waterbirds, because resident birds, which happen to be waterbirds or living in land, are also covered by the work we do. The part of the work I'm leaving out, but in which there has got quite a significant involvement, are three, and I want to name them here. Maybe you may invite them into Friday for Birds in the future. The first is the RSPB's marine program. It's a BirdLife International marine program that RSPB hosts. The second one is the Great Agora Conservation Program, which brings together the Society for Conservation Nature in Liberia, the Conservation Society of Sierra Leone, and the RSPB. And the final group of work I want to mention here is the raptors conservation. There are many friends and colleagues here who do amazing work. And in terms of the work I do, I see BirdLife International's team leading into that work. Into then my talk today. Introducing these Atlantic flyways is not easy, and that's particularly because birds move in different patterns. But if we were to narrow it into a simple shape, you'll see those black arrows representing more or less direction of migratory landbirds using this Atlantic flyway, and the red color, showing the costs, mostly coastal sites, although we acknowledge they're important to wetlands, like in the Niger Delta, again, which is really vital for migratory waterbirds. Back in 2015, then, there were a lot of work which was published in previous years, like the 5 years before, since 2009, 2014, including the work which was published in IBIS, showing that landbirds, especially long-distance migrants, were declining sharply. So BirdLife partners came together and they decided to form a coalition, the East Atlantic Flyway Initiative, to help deliver conservation work together at scale. So we set ourselves 3 objectives. The first one was to identify priority threats, and that was work of scientists from our organizations. Strengthening capacity of the partners along the flyway, because again, the network, the strength of the network is to find its weakest link. So finding the weakest links and strengthening them is key. And finally, promoting the approach of local to global, because we know that local communities on the ground who live side by side with wildlife at any stage of migration. It could be on breeding grounds, on passage, or wintering grounds. The logos I'm showing are the partners who were nominated to lead the task force which developed the East Atlantic Flyway. But how about the flyway itself? It covers 75 countries in total. It's rich in wildlife, especially birds. Estimates think about over 1 billion of waterbirds living in this flyway and more than 2.5 billion of landbirds. But most of those are declining. They may be at the margins because the general trend that's showing, they're still listed vulnerable or stable, but those species must really get our attention. The example with turtle dove, which is globally vulnerable, is in case here, where we saw its population here in the UK declining by 98% over 50 years. As I mentioned at the onset and thanking the scientists, the work we do for conservation is led by science. Work like the one done on the annual census of waterbirds, with every year carrying out a comprehensive census to give key sites like those who can see highlighted there on the map, from the Wadden Sea to the Wash in the east of England, to the many sites in the Iberia Peninsula and West Africa. Using geolocators on small pasture lines like pied flycatcher, we're able to map where those birds, how those birds traveled using the amount of light. The scientists, I think, there was a nice talk previously which did show us how much of that work can really be revealed through tracking of the amount of light. So again, you can see the location of where the birds, the frequency you can find them, and therefore following them in delivering conservation is important. And then for bigger birds like turtle dove, using satellite tags where possible. And that's giving live data in real time, knowing where the bird is at a given time. And that was really important. And following them, we're able to do more work. So the RSPB set itself the amount of work to do to get started. We couldn't work in every of those places, so we have to choose. And choosing exemplar landscapes where we can show some of the actions that can take place and have an impact, and hopefully others to copy was the way forward. We worked with 7 partners in building their capacity, and that is really key to that work we're doing. Those five landscapes I mentioned are listed there. We've got the wet grasslands in South Iceland. If you need a good password there, it's the name of the location. And then we've got the savannahs of northern Ghana. We've got the east coast of England. And then we've got the Upper Guinean forest in Sierra Leone and Liberia. I want to be touching those because they're part of the GOLA program, mainly of that work. And then Berg River Estuary, on which I'll be closing the talk. Finding my arrow. This slide shows you the overview of what IUCN readily shows on waterbirds. It's a snapshot of those. But if you look on the column on your right, you can see that the three which are part of the globally threatened species which occur in our flyway. And others, they're also highlighted in red, near threatened. And that's really should be triggering us to think, how can we work hard to protect sites on which these birds depend on? I'm going to take you then on a journey which takes us from up in Iceland. There, Flyway, or BirdLife Iceland, is our partner there. You can see their logo on the map. And the view you're seeing there is a typical well-managed site on which the birds, which winter in the south, the small waterbirds, would find themselves dispersed, breeding during the summer. Around this time when we think those birds are busy moving upwards, and some of them occupying territories by this time. But what are the birds we found in there? You can see quite a few of them. The snipe, we've got the black-tailed godwit, we've got the wimbrels, really a very rich diversity of waterbirds that find themselves a good home to breed. And that's really, it's snapshots of the importance of Iceland for the waterbirds breeding that is really summarized in the first point. But in the second or final point that I put there, the grasslands are really good storage for carbon. And when you get them drained, they become a carbon source instead of being a carbon sink. In terms of that wildlife and birds I showed there, you can see some of the plight of the species. Like the golden plover, we said, it's a huge population of those of the world found in that small island. But they decline, all of them, so the oyster catcher near threatened, black-tailed godwit near threatened, dunlin near threatened. Any impact you can add to those, you can see quickly those tipping into vulnerable category, and if not higher. But you may say, what are the problems? The history goes back to nearly 80 years at the end of the Second World War. It's when Iceland started to try to grow its own cereals and it gets enough food for the population. But the challenge there had to be, they had to drain a lot of those grasslands to get the soil ready to cultivate. But by cutting those trenches, the grassland would dry out. But that, as you can see, that photo wasn't taken so many years ago. The cutting of trenches and draining of the grasslands still continuing even today. And that's particularly because when you dry the land, it increases in value in terms of its commercial value. But in terms of biodiversity and the functioning of the ecosystem, the value goes down. If you thought that was a zoomed in photo, that gives you a wider view. Again, to give you an example of the scale, That's the size of the vehicle. The people who did take that photo are traveling in. The other threat, which came possibly linked to the warming up of our planet, is that trees started growing in that high latitude, which means now, because trees are growing, tree planting started becoming an attractive prospect. But that's not good for birds, particularly because recent studies did show that the closer you get to those afforested areas, the fewer birds you get. Certainly the breeding success drops significantly. So that policy had to be opposed. It's been opposed for the last 20 years, but does rear its head from time to time. So our work then with our partner, in a coalition of partners that we've got in Iceland, is to get the campaign of rewetting much of the sites. So working with the local municipalities, which are local governments, to allow us to work with them to establish the good wet habitats that used to be there as native, instead of introducing trees. It's supporting all the legislations, including opposing those which are against, like that cutting of the trenches, draining up the grasslands, and planting trees. And the more important that we work with the building capacity of our partners I mentioned, because so it's quite a small team, but a very, very influential team to keep growing. They've got a great coalition of partners helping them to deliver, so that we can have habitats like the ones you can see on the right hand of the slide. Moving on then into the east of England, that photo is from Snettisham Nature Reserve. It shows an amazing sight when you visit and you enjoy watching birds. Being in that view, I don't think you need a telescope. You don't need binoculars. You should just stand there and take it in. It shows a habitat at its best. So in east of England, the RSPB is working with many partners around here to try to create a landscape that will conserve important sites around us. So that will go from the Humber to the north, and all the way to the mouth of the River Thames. And that's a view of the Wallasey wetland site being recently restored by the RSPB with other partners in the mouth of, not far from London. So designating a series of those coastal wetland sites into the World Heritage Sites would give us a protection, because that will allow us to communicate and work with other sites along the Flyway in protecting and conserving the species that we share. Species like the avocets, which is the emblem of RSPB, the oyster culture that you can see on the photo there, and many others. You may say, why are the migrants there? We've got some of those on the photo, the spoonbill, which migrates nicely in Africa. The last time I was in Senegal, it was there in good numbers for wintering. They may be heading back to come and to breed over here. Or we've got to go to the pink-footed geese, which migrate north up into Iceland to breed. So again, all those species you can see, they're really important, and the sites linked together will help us to conserve them better. And the view of the sites I was mentioning is from the Humber. This is a famous wash in east of England. If you happen to enjoy watching waterbirds, that would be highly recommended. But coming all the way into the mouth of the Thames here, within the Wallasey to the north, or the Kentish wetlands to the south. Turning into then the landbirds, I thought I would share with you there the list which is on the screen. It's a list of the birds of conservation concern here in the UK, which happen to be migrants, landbirds, and their conservation status here in the UK. Can you see them all are red? We've got also a list of amber, and we've got those which have no longer breeding onto these shores. You can look up onto the internet, the UK red list of birds. You can find a good summary there, which is freely available. But what that list tells us is there is better to work hard, and work hard as much as we possibly can to get habitats in addition to the non-plateau farmland birds. These migratory land birds are also in a difficult situation here. And what that means is we need to work with many partners. Some may be considering those spaces to be least concern, as by the global listing of IUCN. But for us, it's really part of that responsibility to keep those populations going. Because if there's a shrinking from here, nobody knows where that shrinking would end. Especially for those species, if you see in the final column to your right, those are actually decreasing. Those are actually stable, which are increasing. That we say, okay, we're going to look after the populations here, but there may not be a big issue elsewhere. But those which are globally declining, because those are global trends, it shows a huge responsibility of working through a coalition like AIMLAP to conserve them. So in terms of landscape work then we're doing to try to conserve them, we work with the Ghana Wildlife Society in northern Ghana to try to establish an exemplar landscape for conservation of area where they may be wintering. And that's in addition, of course, as I mentioned, of the research going on and all the policy work that help to accompany those whilst we're still searching what are issues and how to address them. So in the next few slides, I'm going to be talking through the work in northern Ghana. And I started by showing some of the wildlife. We want to be just limiting ourselves. I know it's Friday for birds, but I thought I'll drop in a few of those to show the amazing wildlife we can find in Mole National Park. But also we've got some birds and good birds. But despite all that rich wildlife, those sites are very much in danger. That's particularly because of the competing land use by the communities. Bushfires can be started at any time, especially when the grass is dry and the farmers want fresh grass for the livestock. Illegal logging is a real issue. As always, when you've got woody savanna or forests, logging becoming a problem. Poaching of wildlife, again, it can be unsustainable, especially when you get towns start developing all around a reserve like Mole National Park. And finally, we've got to the unsustainable agriculture practices. That's for food production, commercial production, livestock grazing, and so on. To give you a view of what you see when you've got a height, you can see the boundary. That's a simple earth road they are separating on your left a well-preserved national park, and to the right a very degraded woodland that used savanna woodland that used to be similar to the side to the left. And how long can that continue before you get a situation now where the birds which enjoy the nice system to the left, not being able to find good habitat to the right? So something had to happen. And what we've done was to go and work with a partner there and talk to the community in redeploying the landscape approach, which is to consider the people living in the area as part of that ecosystem. They have the right to live there. They've been there for all their lives. But what we need to do is to listen to them, to hear what their concerns are, what site may be, part of the site they can be willing to set aside for conservation. And Ghana has got a very novel model called Community Resource Management Areas, or CREMAs. And those are the ones we are working to establish with the communities, working with the Wildlife Division, which is part of Forestry Commission of Ghana. Of course, the whole work led on the ground by the Ghana Wildlife Society. And part of the restoration of the areas which have been degraded, we go through planting of native species. And that's, again, it's one of the GWA staff attending a nursery in which we started growing seedlings to be given freely to communities for replanting and restoring their sites. Looking then into the long term, what are we going to move into next? It's good to get the community resource established, but without getting them to find proper businesses to do, again, they don't do much. They may resort back to the usual dependence on the park and the wildlife in the neighborhood. Their practice won't change. But a mechanism really tackling the livelihoods aspect is the way forward. And that is done through creating enterprises that's going to be, say, targeting share, which is the commodity the most exported from that landscape. And then that goes also by them designating the area designated for conservation. And that can be restored, and we're going to be doing regular monitoring to see whether those areas will qualify and contributing to the Ghana achieving the 30 by 30 goals as OECMs. Then I want to take you to South Africa as the final step of this research tour of the East Atlantic Flyway. There on the map, you'll see the Berg River Estuary, and the work there is led by BirdLife South Africa. I think just 2 weeks ago, we had a talk by Jessica, who works for BirdLife South Africa, talking about the European roller. So again, her and her colleagues work on this particular project. The Berg River Estuary is found in Western Cape, where there are taro points. And it's got quite some amazing avifauna. So when you happen to be visiting Cape Town and want to enjoy birds, I would strongly recommend to really pay a visit, responsibly, of course. And you've got a few more of those birds, and hoping that that will whet your appetite to be able to go there and visit. But despite that wildlife, in terms of pressures which are there, remains. You can view how the banks of the Berg River are being drained away. The dredging for sand, that again, it's a big problem. The extraction of water for agriculture, another big problem. Construction of infrastructures like that bridge you can see in the view, or using the water for recreation purpose. That can create a huge amount of disturbance into the area. There's been also the channelization of the river. That again adds to the obstruction and the destruction of the riverbanks. And those tend to be really rich ecosystems, healthy banks, where birds can find good habitat, either in the water or the edges of it. So, like on this photo here, the responsible use, have to be sustainable. And a colleague of mine spotted that interesting sign there. And one way we wonder whether that bird is among those people invited to join to that breakfast. So what are we doing? What is BirdLife South Africa doing with the support with the partners, including the RSPB? So the list of pressures, I mentioned the heavy use, but also the drought can be a problem. A few years ago, they had the phenomenon of flooding that followed a bad drought, and that really caused a lot of damage. Damming of rivers is never a good thing. And of course, the trampling of the banks can easily lead to the erosions. So the approach we're taking is to restore habitat, to improve and monitor the habitats as they're being created and how useful they're being used by all wildlife, including birds, but also increasing legal protection of the site, including people not being able to drive their 4x4s for any use in the proximity of the riverbank. And of course, that to go through the buy-in by local communities, which can be achieved by awareness raising and sharing knowledge of the potential impacts of such use. That's a map from the management plan for the area, showing the in blue areas which legally can be quickly be protected, but in yellow, the areas that also have been marked by landowners voluntarily to be contributed towards managing that landscape properly. And this work at this stage being funded by the Ecosystem Restoration Fund. So I've done that with a tour of the sites and landscapes. I would like to close by talking about an additional piece of work we do in Senegal. There on the photo, you'll see the training that was recently given by my colleague, Sim Bezang. And that's a part of the training in KBAs. The KBA has been adopted as one of those instruments by the CBD Convention to be measuring the impact that governments are having conserving biodiversity in their territories. Therefore, getting KBAs designated, getting national coordination groups established, and getting our partners leading the work on conservation, site conservation, landscapes conservation using KBA as a tool is very, very important. So that work is in progress and is expanding in many African countries as it is in other parts of the world. We've got also a master's program in Senegal that's helped us train ornithologists because we found there was a gap in capacity, individual capacity, that when organizations want to hire good ornithologists, they didn't have people ready to be employed, especially in Francophone West Africa. Can say we were very lucky to get the permission to replicate the work of Aplori, that's a paid Adventist Ornithological Institute in northern Nigeria, to train good ornithologists. We're now starting with a third cohort this year. In closing then, what are recent successes? I'm going to point on two of them. There are a few more I could name, but the time is advancing. The turtle dove, which was listed as that vulnerable species, probably threatened, almost decimated here in the UK. We've got good sign that following a moratorium on hunting in European populations, especially in Western Europe, the population may be ticking up again. That's no accident. You can view again the presentation that Carlos Carboneras gave on that work that he's coordinating a few weeks ago. But here in the UK, what have we done? Establishing Operation Turtle Dove, working with the farmers who are the landowners on supplementary feeding, setting aside hedges, cultivating wildflowers so that birds can have enough food in the summer. All those are the ways in which we've been able to help this species, its population in the UK, to prosper. But problems can be happening elsewhere. So we're working with the grape palm in Morocco to monitor the species there in that country as well, especially preventing that any leakage of moratorium hunting in Europe will be moved across into Morocco. We're working also with the partner in Senegal, NCD, to make sure that the government keeps the turtle dove off the huntable list of birds in that country. That's some of the actions we've been doing for that particular species. Another success linked to policy this time, and all the partners in the East Atlantic Fly working together, was the saving of the Tegas estuary from the developing of the second airport for Lisbon in Portugal. That work started back in 2019 when the government decided out of the blue to start developing a second airport. Of course, it was hard to defend the case without the science. So scientists quickly did analysis, and they proved that, like that middle slide showed, that so many sites in West Africa, in West and Central Europe, Northern Europe, all those sites were connected to the Tegas. And therefore, taking out that site, all the work, all the investment invested in conservation, all the efforts may be being harmed by that single site being taken out. So preserving the connectivity of this flyway was really important. And after heavy campaigning, the government of Portugal last year decided to shelve that project. It's not completely abandoned, it must be said, but the court have ruled that the government find other sites in which the builder partners pair with their partners will be prepared to collaborate and to get proper assessments so that the development can take place without damaging the environment. So where do we land? I think during these few minutes, I've been able to take you on a journey to show that it's really a network of sites connected together that's going to help us provide enough habitat, enough home for migratory birds, especially waterbirds and landbirds. We won't be monitoring them if we don't provide that good connectivity and safeguarding it. But there is a big challenge that I didn't mention, and that is linked to the climate change. We know climate is changing. We didn't mention the impact it was having, including the temptation of planting trees on the grasslands in Iceland. But the birds as well, their ecology is changing, responding to the warming up of temperatures, the availability of food in different places. Like there was indeed a talk recently where one of the presenters on this platform mentioned the shortening of those migration from long distance almost towards a short distance. That is bad news, particularly because we don't fully understand how all those systems are going to respond. Possibly the best solution would be if we can stay with the systems that is functioning and the birds keeping the usual routes that we're familiar with. As you saw in the map I did show earlier also, there's still lots of gaps. The gaps in terms of knowledge, especially where landbirds, the full ecology of them, and that's particularly because they tend to disperse widely on wintering grounds. There are a huge amount of knowledge on the breeding grounds, but there's so much research here to be done on wintering ground. There is also a gap in terms of presence of conservation NGOs and strong partners into this partnership we've got, which is East Atlantic Flyway Initiative. Places like the Congo Basin, you can go from east of Nigeria all the way into Namibia. That's where we start finding other strong NGOs which are doing the work. So a call being sent out to really come forward for collaboration in terms of research, in terms of policy, in terms of conservation delivery through NGO work. So I'd like to thank a few more people, especially thanking the two arms of the CMS, which really provide useful tools into the delivery of the policy work in this flyway. Those are MLAP and Iowa. I'd like us to thank the donors, as I mentioned in the opening, because this work, as you can imagine, requires significant investments, and we cannot get there without that funds. I'd like us to thank you for your very kind attention.